Hello and welcome to the Regulatory Matters webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Regulatory Science and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on the role of AI and ML in medical product development and regulatory science with Jonathan Helfgott. My name is Natalie Koss and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Regulatory Matters playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Regulatory Matters. I'm Bill Barrier, Program Director for the Regulatory Science Program. For those of you who are not familiar with all our programs, we are part of the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, and dropping it down one level, the Center for Biotechnology Education. The center offers degrees in biotechnology, computational biology, bioinformatics, and then there is the Business and Regulatory Division, where we are regulatory science in all areas, as well as we offer another degree in the biotechnology, business, enterprise, and entrepreneurship. So again, thank you for being on board. We tell our prospective students that, there's the biotechnology or the science, and then there's the business and the regulatory. And if you're going to get any product to the marketplace, two groups that you have to make sure that you are good with are the regulators and, of course, the business people. And so that's what we provide. We are really proud of our program that all of our faculty are subject matter experts. They work in the government. They work in corporate America. They are entrepreneurs. They work in startups. So we have quite a range of experience that we like to apply to our programs, and we're glad to have you on here today. So as I mentioned, this is the second part. We did a soft launch back in December, and we have some upcoming webinars that we will be doing. Just a plug for the one that we will be doing in April. It will be conducted by Dr. Jonathan Helfgott, and we will cover perspectives on dietary supplement regulations. And we have some more going on as well. We keep expanding our program. We've just introduced a course on recalls and traceability. We're doing one on cannabis. And of course, this new one I just talked about is dietary supplements. So there's my shameless plug for our program today. But, we're in the heart of DC and Baltimore, so we are where all the regulators are. And so we do have a real pulse on that. So what I'd like to do next is give our speaker, Jonathan Helfgott, an opportunity to introduce himself. As I talked about, such really good faculty that we have, Jonathan is no exception to that. So with that, Jonathan, could you please just give a brief bio of yourself before we get into the presentation?
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Barrier. Spent about 10 years at the FDA, both at the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health, as well as the Centers for Drugs Evaluation and Research, CDRH and CDER, most recently as the Associate Director for Risk Science, and been part of Hopkins for almost 15 years now. As well, I'm also alumni, so really passionate about regulatory science, education, innovation in medical developments, and it's a real privilege today to be hopefully picking up where we left off and going a little deeper into some of the primary considerations for AI ML-based technologies.
Thank you, Jonathan. And for people on this webinar today, the very first time around, we basically wanted to level set before Jonathan kind of got overly deep into the presentation. So please refer to the YouTube channel, because that webinar is up there, if you will. You can find it under our social media pages. But nonetheless, with that, we'll get started with the presentation.
Excellent. And as mentioned, even for those that didn't have a chance to go through the intro lecture. The information, although builds upon the foundational knowledge of FDA regulatory requirements, we will go a little deeper into some of the specific considerations when it comes to these unique technologies, often comparing and contrasting both with high-level software as in a medical device, as well as hardware and some of the traditional methods used to evaluate and develop medical products. We're going to start at the strategic level with regards to going through some of the recommendations and highlights from major guidances on this topic, as well as the levels of communication and detailed information that is going to expected to be provided to regulators. And it should be noted, although the foci remains primarily on FDA regulatory requirements and recommendations and policies, it also, a lot of the principles apply equally to some of the international regulatory bodies and review processes such as that in the European Medicines Agency as part of the EU, as well as the PMDA in Japan. And they have, of course, some of their own unique requirements, but overall, with respect to alignment with the ISO and IEC internationally recognized consensus standards, there's significant overlap with regards to a lot of the applicability, both regarding some of the discussions we're going to have today on this topic, as well as in general regarding the oversight and compliance with medical products on a global scale. We're going to end the lecture talking about the spectrum of products that you're seeing now supporting the diagnostic aid, detections, and eventually lifestyle changes with respect to everything from imaging systems to wearables and analyzing electronic health record data. And the integration of all of these technologies from a patient perspective, what needs to be clinically validated, what's the level of evidence, how much information is good enough both on the technical side as well as the ability to demonstrate correlations and even causality between better outcomes upon use of treatment or better methods of detection and diagnosis. So these are the themes that we're going to cover for part 2 of our lecture. And as we highlighted in part 1, once you've identified and determined that your intended use meets the definition either of a medical device or a combination product specifically, then it's important to ensure that you categorize your product appropriately. And there's a 3-tiered risk-based classification used for medical device regulation oversight by the FDA. And it's important upfront, if there's a novel technology, to engage with the agency early and often. And there are various mechanisms available to industry to submit what are called Q submissions or pre-submissions, depending on what phase of development, whether you're at the research phase, what's called pre-IDE phase, or even have a product perhaps on the market internationally and looking to enter the US market, or anywhere in between along your way on the clinical development path life cycle. It's valuable to be able to check in with the reviewers and the divisions that are going to be responsible for evaluating the product that you plan to submit and market. So there's a lot of rules of thumb that can be applied with regards to best practices, how to articulate the best questions, the strategy in which you're going to engage the agency, but ultimately transparency and ensuring you focus on unknown scientific and clinical information that's needed to drive a decision. These are the general topics that are most useful in leveraging the Q submission process available through CDRH. Can't go through all of these in detail for a 1 hour lecture. I will note, as part of our graduate program, some of these guidances actually merit an entire 3 hour lecture by themselves. So it's going to be beyond the capacity with respect to time restriction of going intimately into these details. However, I think this is a nice cheat sheet to get started with respect to compiling all of the most relevant recommendations from FDA collectively on this topic. And you can see it starts very broadly with respect to the level of documentation, which we'll go through in just a few slides here, that's going to be included. And this is, of course, predicated upon being able to have already effectively determined, based off of an intended use and clear device description, what category you fall under. These are the levels of both documentation and scientific expectations and even technical engineering level of detail that the agency is expecting to see. So just some key topics you can see: cybersecurity controls, especially for networked and connected devices. Big issue that is heavily scrutinized because of the risk exposure of it. Perhaps in many ways, it's the number one most likely issue to be failing and exposing the product to noncompliance. As we talked about at the international level, the IMDRF, that the FDA formally participates in and recognizes, identifies, and has a whole treasure of very useful information on both SA and IMD, as well as AI and ML in general. But nonetheless, please take a look at some of these key guidances. Make sure you have them included in your library if you don't already. And we're now going to give you a little sample of the pre-market submission guidance and what it says.
Jonathan, if I may, as Jonathan mentioned, there's a lot packed in here, but for you to get even deeper and more deeper, do consider being a student in our program for Masters of Regulatory Science. And I will also tell you that we are in the process of developing a non-degree, non-credit certificate for regulatory affairs. That'll be coming in the future. So take it from here, please, Jonathan.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to emphasize this, I mean, every single one of these, even subtopics themselves, folks have become subject matter experts. Human factors, right? Major considerations: risk management, clinical development. And in many ways, these are still all subcategories of regulatory science in and of itself. So it's a real privilege to, as Dr. Barrier said, have world-class students, both globally as well as here in the area as part of our program, and we're able to really learn from each other and cover key topics that allow our next generation of leaders to go out and make sure that we're using these technologies and this information to support innovation, because that's what it's all about. But you still have to have, going back to the slide, the evidence, right? As they trained us at FDA, in God we trust, everyone else must provide documentation. So this means there needs to be detailed description on exactly what the life cycle model was and the methodologies and the policies in place. A discussion of the graphical, the symbolic, and any models that are conventional for the analysis and design of the model itself. Any error logging, tracking, how you're tracing risk. And there's two levels of documentation based off of the device category that you're going to fall under with respect to the level of detail and information that's going to be submitted to the agency. As you can see, the enhanced level of documentation is for the higher risk, and basic level of documentation is for those flaws in a failure mode of any device in which software is controlling or operating it to not result in either a serious injury to the patient or of course, possibility of death. Now, there are what's called a software bill of materials that is equivalent to, for those in the industry that might be more familiar with, when you're making an actual physical device itself. And this is going to include the operating system, the compiler, right? And you're going to also want to list any simulators, off-the-shelf software, automated software engineering tools, ASEs, concurrent applications, any LLMs, which we'll get to, right? And anticipated system loads, single or multi-mode users. These are all going to drive the level of detail and information that you still as a company have to keep, but what ultimately gets submitted to the FDA is outlined in the guidance document, whereby, for example, things like the software requirements specifications, the full test verification, validation, testing, risk matrices, those are all going to be included in the enhanced level of documentation, whereby you're going to have a discussion of the configurations, the management and change control procedures. This is an example of what a data flow diagram can look like. It's for an imaging system, which for a lot of the AI ML-based products have been dominated by with respect to market entry. So I thought this was a really good example for folks to be able to utilize. And the ability to explain in a visual how a system is ingesting information, analyzing information, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what are the weighted scores, is there a training aspect? In many ways, when I was back at the agency and we would train the reviewers, I would often refer to this, the data flow diagram, as the roadmap from which you can then begin to evaluate your system. And of course, it's going to be cross-referenced to additional information that will need to be aligned and reflective of, from a sequential processing, how even as you can see here, for example, whether an image is manually or automatically uploaded, how it's classified, how it's ultimately provided to the end user. Is it an integrated system? There's so many specifics, but as you can see, a nice, well-articulated diagram with a good legend that points you to the supporting information. I would almost add, within the absence of a visual, I would oftentimes have to create one as a former FDA reviewer. So it's really important, even though it's not required, you will want to, in a visual representation, explain how your system's functioning step by step, piece by piece. And the agency applies risk-based science, and similarly, with regards to software validation, we take a risk-based approach, where the higher risk-based functionalities require more rigorous testing, and there's no specific protocol that's outlined. It's up to the manufacturer, it's up to the developers, and there are international standards such as the IEC 62304 software medical device life cycle development that is indeed formally recognized by the agency and adopted as guidance as well. So you can see that there's multiple different opportunities for software developers to utilize this useful information that the agency makes available in the guidances, in the standards, not just necessarily as, oh, I have to comply with that, right? And I always try to educate folks from the quality side that are, let's say, being trained on the quality system in the first place. Don't let the tail wag the dog. Don't think that you're forcing yourself to do things because of compliance. Rather, if you build your product the right way, using quality processes, building quality into the product itself, you will by default comply with the regulatory requirements.
Jonathan, excuse me, you just made me think of something here. Actually, a couple of questions. On validation, it's having me think about, lab developed tests and how, there's a thing going on where the FDA accordingly is supposed to be, approving those. I'm not sure where that's going to go in the future. And then I also think about, the Chevron doctrine, which supposedly now is going to be interpreted by the judicial function. But having said that, is validation an art or is it a science?
Excellent question. I think it's a mixture of both. And you have to integrate, as you pointed out, the legal considerations, the policy considerations, the engineering level elements of whatever it is that you're building. And that's going to drive the final validation protocol because, as you'll see, there's really no one size fits all approach. It doesn't work like that. In fact, the regulatory requirements themselves are non-prescriptive in nature. All they can do is provide examples and guidelines and suggestions to help industry, to help the manufacturers make sure that the information that they're providing is going to be able to support a marketing authorization decision and ultimately demonstrate that the product is safe and effective for use and the benefits outweigh the risks. And to your point about, the laboratory developed tests, and of course, this is really matched up with what's happening on the software side because you add a lot of these technologies on and you're doing way more than just some screening, and it gets into some of the deeper diagnostic aspects, which as you foreshadowed, we'll touch upon later on in the presentation with respect to coupling a lot of the technologies with some of the traditional methods of diagnosis and medical treatment. But even as we kind of now go deep into the technology aspect of software and validation, and there is science, but there's also the art of I get to decide as a manufacturer what is going to be the best approach for my product. And that is a double-edged sword because it's both creative of some freedoms, but as well as restrictive because the onus and burden is on you because as a lot of those disclaimers in the FDA guidances state, these are not binding requirements. However, if you choose to follow an alternative approach, the burden is on you, manufacturer or sponsor, to demonstrate why you were still able to achieve the same results and why it was suitable. And that's why, as a rule of thumb, it's always best, in my experiences, when applicable, to follow as directly and consistently as possible the recommendations from FDA guidances. And it's when those gray areas happen that you have to become an artist and mix and match, pick and choose how you're going to defend with as much confidence as you can and evidence provided to support each claim you're going to make. Ultimately, that your product is fit for purpose. And in this case, that your software was validated. So this is perhaps, Bill, the most important question for folks to appreciate, that it's not just going in at this with the checklist mentality, but appreciating that part of the reasons why we train regulatory professionals is so that they understand the nuances on solving these real world problems. Because if it were as easy as step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, well, then there really wouldn't be as much demand as there is in our industry. But as you can see, this slide here is reflective of the essence of the validation activities, whereby you're doing this combination of preventative mechanisms of ensuring that there's no errors or possibilities of anomalies being inserted through quality design controls crisp user needs managed through a formal process that's identified and traced the risks. And even when there's an issue, when there's a non-conformance, we have the ability to do two things: detect the problem and remove it.
Jonathan,
And so
sorry,
it's twofold.
we have a question here. You know how I feel about standardization and as well as harmonizations, and these things just get to be a little bit too loose as far as I'm concerned. But here's a question. It says for a mobile app SAMD with no hardware components, is there still expectation to have an SVOM, or is a SOUP document listing dependencies sufficient?
Well, it depends on what the intended use is. Just because it's a mobile app doesn't necessarily determine the extent of information that's going to need to be required. So for the purposes of an FDA pre-market submission, it would be driven by the IFU. And if it was going to be in the higher risk category, as we highlighted earlier, they would expect the enhanced level of documentation that would include the full life cycle development, the SBOM, the SOUP, the software of unknown pedigree, and everything listed. Whereas if it's in the lower risk basic documentation category, then the information may be more limited.
I have one more question, and this is a good one. It says for FDA regulatory approval of an AI ML based medical device, is it necessary for the training data set to be representative of the US population? Ooh, don't get me going on that one. Or is it more important to validate the system in a clinical study using a population with substantial equivalence to the US population?
Great questions. So that's a multi-tiered response because you're asking about validating data sets, you're asking about clinical validation, the US-based population. I would respond that they're all important and we have to balance priorities. Yes, the data set needs to be reflective of the heterogeneity in the US population. Therefore, just by doing research in single locations in other countries that have more homogeneous populations, such as South America, Asia, even Europe, parts of Europe and Africa, you're going to have a combination of sites and of data to demonstrate, yes, for FDA approval purposes, it does match. And we'll talk actually a little bit more about training algorithms and how you're going to communicate the transparency of the origins of the data and whether it's considered clinically valid and fit for purpose. So these are great questions. I guess perhaps we can conclude on the technical side that we're looking to test as many conditions as possible, right? Normal cases, stress test it to fail, understanding what the parameters are. Maybe there's some special characters with exceptional data cases where maybe no data might be entered, wrong paths, missing paths, user attempts unreasonable actions or actually tries to break the system. Of course, in cybersecurity, they do penetration reports to make sure that hackers can't even access. So these are the kinds of considerations that are needed to be taken into account upfront once you've defined your product, identified the pathway, and are looking to validate it. With respect to the risk management, it's both not just at the software level, but also at the high level device level functionality itself. If it's a component accessory to an existing medical device, then we have to understand how it functions, the interrelationship. Now we get into some of the unique considerations for AI, ML-based technologies. One thing to keep in mind is, as pointed out, these models, these systems can be moving targets. They're not always as locked in or completed the way even traditional SAMD or other type of hardware-based systems are developed. And so there's these various agency guidances that we'll go through. We'll talk through. I have some specific cases. And I'm sorry, I think there's does anyone hear a little audio feedback? I just wanted to, yeah, I think we're okay. Excellent. Thank you. There's always questions regarding what kind of changes can be made to a device that's AI ML based once it's already been either cleared or approved by the FDA, in which it's looking to be optimized. It's looking to train itself. And at what point do those parameters require a new review? So the first place to go to is the 510K software change guidance that really talks about the primary issue is, do these changes introduce any new considerations for functionality or safety and effectiveness? And if it does not significantly impact safety or effectiveness of the device, then a new 510K is oftentimes not required. Again, of course, there's a lot of caveats to that. And as I was alluding to, within AI, cybersecurity is a real emerging space because you have to share and access the data. A lot of it is proprietary, and you have privacy laws, and then even tack on the global considerations when you're thinking of GPDR and HIPAA here. And it's multifactorial.
Jonathan, I have to ask you this question. You know, there's a new kid on the block called DeepSeek, open source, but even the big guys are kind of in awe of what it did. So as we're talking about cybersecurity risks and all these open sources they're used as the backbones of some of these things, what are your views on how that plays into the cybersecurity risk?
Wow. I think it's a really complicated question for multiple reasons. First of all, there's no prohibition under any part of 21 CFR that FDA will prohibit the use of any type of software. The burden is on the manufacturer, the developer, to make sure that whatever software, whatever programs they're using are ultimately going to be fit for purpose, and that specified requirements can be consistently fulfilled. So I know that there are, Excel spreadsheets that are developed into drug dosing calculators, and they're formally commercialized, and they have their own regulatory classification. So I can imagine that a company may expect to use a company like DeepSeek or some other new or potentially emerging software code. But the key is okay, how are you ensuring there's no system manipulation? There's no data corruption and poisoning, right? If you're utilizing some aspect of it within the transmission or at rest, data lifecycle process. What about the potential for online system manipulation, right? There's just so many risks that, to me, it would be very difficult to be able to provide the level of evidence and assurance that I would need at this time to be able to demonstrate that it would be FDA grade validated. But again, it's not to say it couldn't be done. It just goes back to what level of assurance can you have, or risks and fail-safe modes can you put in place to allow the use of these kinds of new technologies that, of course, we want to be able to benefit from the cost-effective use of these kinds of solutions, but they have to be done in a smart and meaningful way. And I expect that new companies in the future will also similarly be appealing for a lot of the startups to figure out, how do you, whether it's ChatGPT or other LLMs, as we talked about, and how do you managing the uncertainties? It all depends on what the indications for use are, what the relative risks are, and how you're going to balance all that.
You know, I have to mention this because we were talking about AI, but I saw this remarkable piece last night on NBC News about a medical device that was being used to help someone with a lot of paralysis. And it's using AI, which was fascinating to help the person who was not able to use any of his hands or anything of that nature to be able to do so. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in this area. So even more so when you think about, the cybersecurity risk, you got people with implants in their brains and all the possible things you can think of. I think this is something that's going to have to really be looked at, very carefully as we go down the road.
Absolutely. And, going back to, false positives versus false negatives and the true positives and the true negatives, how do you corroborate this with regards to, is it accurate? Is it a complete report? Are these results sensitive enough to allow for medical decision making? It all depends, right? It depends on the level of evidence. Sorry, I'm getting an echo. I apologize. And the ability to learn, as Dr. Barrier was saying, from the information that's already generated and have this continuous learning life cycle whereby the more users, the more data, the more you can fine tune and increase sensitivity and specificity with regards to the actual performance. And remember, there's different subsets of the way these systems can be set up. And that's why I like the visuals of ML really being a subcategory of AI, although maybe it's not autonomous, where it's being more directed, as you can see. And some parts are maybe unsupervised. And I think that's where some of the even bioethics considerations, not just regulatory, come into play. But as we switch paradigms, going from freeze frame, lock, release, pause, reevaluate. If you need to make a change, it goes through formal change control processes. Now you're seeing these agile environments whereby it's happening automatically. You're building these things in, not just really for software, but even the integrated hardware, software, firmware types of products, types of medical solutions that are leveraging technology overall to make their products better, cheaper, and deliver them faster. Now, the considerations are oftentimes when a company either is first getting set up, what is their quality culture versus companies that are already established. So you have to really understand what your niche is, how you're manufacturing products. If you're just a software company, your quality system needs to be tailored accordingly. If you're working across, across different departments and you need interdisciplinary feedback, you're always going to need clinical input. You're always going to want to have well-defined user needs, because if you don't have those build to specs, it doesn't really matter what you create, you're not going to be able to validate it. But are you also doing things automatically or introducing what we call competent human intervention, whereby the programs are tools that are simply assisting, whether it's clinicians or even different users, from making enhanced decisions?
Jonathan, I know time is really flying on us, but I have a couple of questions, one from me and one from one of our viewers. One is, if interoperability is a factor, should cybersecurity be explained in the context of both system integration, such as AI ML solution interoperability with an EMR, and internal cybersecurity measures such as HQ and R&D security using solutions like Fortinet or Palo Alto networks? And let me throw mine in there while we're at it. So these algorithms you're talking about, how locked in do they need to be, depending on the therapeutic solution you're trying to achieve?
Great question. And the answer is yes. You depending on, of course, the intended use and how ultimately it's intended to be utilized, that's going to drive whether it's integrated with EHRs or going to be a standalone system that folks are going to have to manually, upload images or other data and pieces of information. And going back to your last question regarding some of the concepts of whether or not we're able to look at the different kinds of uses for different clinical indications is all going to be driven by what's the value proposition. And if you don't articulate how you're solving a problem, you don't have a product, even if you have a really cool piece of software that's being used, but it's not really filling an unmet clinical need. It's tracking something that's not necessarily clinically meaningful. Those aren't really useful. And you can see here that the need to fill these gaps are only increasing, and technology and AI ML based solutions in particular are an obvious solution because whether it's general diagnosis for really all conditions or supporting radiologists to be able to do higher throughput screening, right? A lot of the times, in fact, are spent reviewing the normals, but really what the best use of radiologist times are the abnormals to make sure that if there are any abnormalities that require further medical attention, they could spend their time on it. So a lot of the value propositions for these, especially these imaging tool products, are they enhance efficiencies, right? Being able to, with a high degree of confidence, screen out the normals and flag and detect the abnormals based off of pre-specified parameters that are clinically validated and accepted. And again, that's at the technical level and everything throughout. So it's always relative. Everything's always relative with respect to how much risk tolerance you have regarding what's the indication for use. And here's a good example with respect to being able to detect certain, as just a screening tool, certain retinopathy, retinal, diabetes related eye problems, as well as cardiac ultrasound software using ultrasound technicians to help make sure that they get quality images and get the data necessary to allow the cardiologist to do appropriate diagnoses. So these are just the kinds of examples of products that are AI, ML based, as well as software as and in a medical device that are continuously learning. And to your question about how locked do they have to be, it really depends on what you have and what you've made, what's already approved, and what kind of changes you want to make to it. Because if you're constantly trying to adapt, which is fine because you want to optimize the output, what does that have an impact on functionally with respect to the output of your device? So hopefully now everyone sees the common theme of everything, right? These are general rules of thumbs, but the final decisions are always driven by the specifics of your indications for use, which then tell you the device category, the level of documentation and risk, et cetera, that needs to be managed. And so it's always going to try to build upon real world data, real world information. And this is going to enhance really the continuum of healthcare, not just here domestically in the US, but hopefully abroad. The ability to bring down some of the costs while still maintain high quality of healthcare delivery and detection. You can see the iterative nature of both software as well as AI ML based technologies that are stepping through a sequence that going back to that preventing my slide on software validation, right? That's really the essence here. That's the goal of what we're trying to do. Prevent errors from getting in there in the first place by high quality processes, user needs. And then also on the flip side, once it's out there on the market, the ability to identify errors and remove them once they've been introduced. And this could be in many different forms. Uh, User errors due to non-intuitive interfaces, where I heard everything from making font sizes larger to eliminating certain buttons or making them different shapes and things that significantly reduce the number of complaints and things like that. So again, a lot of human factors uh, also need to be taken into consideration. Now, I love the visual on this slide because a lot of what we do when we think about different products and life cycle is on a spectrum. And there are bookends. As Dr. Barrier pointed out, there are cases where information and data is going to have to be locked in without really any wiggle room. Let's say a surgical software suite used for neurointerventional procedures. Sure, every now and then you can have what's called the PC predetermined change control plan with, on a certain basis that you'll determine if there's this ability to improve certain aspects of, the performance. But ultimately, when it's out there and it's being deployed, it needs to be locked in place, much like your physical piece of hardware itself. Now, this is contrasted on the other side where there's less risky type of uses, like let's say more patient screening or lower level detection aids, where perhaps, it's on an app like we talked, like, example was shared before, and there's a lot of users, and so there's more continuous adaptation. It's just the environment in which you're able to build your quality system to support those needs, whereby in effect, ideally, when a change control, when a need to adapt the parameter based off of some feedback loop comes in, if the programmer goes in and does it, that full life cycle of activity documentation will automatically be generated by the system itself. That's the idealistic state that you want to be in if you're more to the right on this slide with respect to it's got to be a more almost extreme programming type of environment, agile methodologies. Now, AI ML workflows, they also need to be very clearly defined, much like the data flow diagram, on what information is used to train a model. Of course, there's what we call the rules of thumb, everything from 70, 15, 15, whereby you have to ensure that it's equally distributed. If you're going to, let's say, have 1,000 records, right? Medical records, images that you're going to train your model on, you will have to figure out a mechanism by which you're splitting up 70% of those images, let's say 700 images, and that's what you use to train your model. Then you do a first set of validation. You say, okay, let's run it on 150, see how it performs, stops and pauses, right? And then you might have to retrain it. Oh, it didn't detect this one. Oh, this was a false negative. This was a false positive. And then you save your last 15% or your last 150 records for ideally the final validation. So again, these are just different examples of ways these kinds of models can ultimately be trained. But, and this comes from some of the FDA content itself, it's important that you build the quality into the process, meaning the programmers are trained to know exactly what they need to access, how often they need to access it, what they need to capture. And it's really trickles down, right? It's all the system that you're utilizing. Is it an in-house system? Is it a vendor system, quality system that you're using? There's a lot of these important factors that are going to drive the fluency of any company's workflow. And there's, of course, algorithm change protocols, which we'll talk about in just a second as well. And it goes back to that theme, Dr. Barrier, of how locked versus how unlocked can you keep your algorithm? And, well, until you answer that question, you have to pinpoint, right, exactly what we're talking about. Because sometimes you can have a product with an intended use, and it's a certain aspect of the intended use that you're building upon, right? Everything else remains the same, but it's really this feature, this functionality that we're looking to fine tune. So first, you almost have to, at the product level, and then even at the component level, further map out the functionalities and even the discrete programs and individual bits and pieces to then say, okay, here's what these parameters could or be trained on, or and here's what the possibilities are for impacting what the final results would be in terms of whether, let's say, going with the classic example of uploading a CT scan, and you get a report that helps identify clinical value added risk-based scores like osteoporosis or bone mass density and BMD, etc. You still have to be able to explain step by step, discreetly, how each bit and piece of information was derived, where it went, what was weighed upon, what it was trained with. And then, if there's any need to modify something, wait a minute, it turns out that this parameter, if we fine tune or we weighted it like this, it would better be reflective of patients at higher risk of bone fracture. So therefore, it's a clinical issue that needs to go back. It's not just a technical issue, right? So we need to make sure, yes, is this valid? Do we have the right level of information? It's based off of these records. Look at these outputs. It was tracked over time. It aligns with existing standard of care. These are the types of things that need to be taken into consideration when you finalize what your algorithm change protocol is going to look like, and then ultimately what's called the PCPP, predetermined change control plan, would also look like. How the data is being managed, what's being evaluated, how often you're going to update your procedures, when you need to do retraining. And then, much like there's GXPs, right? Good laboratory practices, under 21 CFR Part 58, that covers the preclinical studies used for FDA grade IND supporting research. You have GCPs, good clinical practices, found under 21 CFR Parts 312 and 812 for INDs and IDEs respectively. You have GMPs for good manufacturing practices for 21 CFR parts 211 and 820 for drugs, biologics, and devices, respectively. And we also have GMLPs, good machine learning practices that companies can utilize to help develop. Now, 21 CFR section yet to be determined, but there are useful guidances that the agency has released and finalized that can guide companies towards appropriate model training, tuning, validation activities. What are the accepted practices? And it's a shift in mindset of going from how do we reactively fix problems to how do we proactively prevent them from happening in the first place. Because when you do a root cause analysis on a flaw, on an error, on a problem, the first thing you want to determine, is it episodic or is it systemic? Is it limited just to this one case or this one product, this one device, or does it manifest itself across all products, all devices, horizontally, vertically? So the ability to take a life cycle approach and manage everything up front and throughout and continuously really allows for max value, max compliance, least burdensome approach, because by default, you're ideally going to be setting up your system to track everything and generate the minimal amount of information that you need, but still important. And you can see, going back to the spectrum, you have more frequent updates, less frequent updates. How much monitoring you're going to have to be doing? How much training do you need to implement? This really speaks to how ultimately you're going to be able to prove if you do make changes, the performance only improves, will only be enhanced. Set baseline parameters, and these include clinical factors as well. And this is the life cycle for AI products. You use the data, you generate a model, it goes through regulatory testing, it goes on the market, and then you have to maintain it. And there's a whole spectrum, of course, on the regulatory risk-based side of what's the intended use? Is it simply triaging versus actually making an independent diagnostic? And of course, based off of those indications for use, that's going to drive the level of documentation, the level of risk. And there's a whole guidance that the agency's provided on this topic, whereby it'll talk about the standalone assessment versus the clinical performance assessment and the labeling that needs to be in there, and the level of detail with regarding to the scoring methodologies. And the penultimate slide before we open this up for questions in the last couple minutes here. How good is good enough? How much data do I need, right? Not just engineering, technical level, but of course, clinical data decision support systems. Can I use results from EHRs in patients abroad? Can we use real-world data, real-world evidence to support expanding indications for use for products that are already on the market? Because that's how I set up my algorithm. The answers are yes. And perhaps this gives us an opportunity to think about part 3, where we can go into further detail about the levels of clinical validation, clinical meaningfulness, sample sizes, and other considerations with respect to further diving into AI ML-based technologies used to support medical product development across the life cycle. I'm going to pause here, and my hope is as we summarize the discussions from starting on the content that we covered on communicate with agency early and often, you have your cheat sheet of applicable guidances. We talked about the specific considerations with regard to AI ML-based type products, the levels of documentation, how you're going to need to set it up based upon your particular intended uses, gave you a few examples of computer-aided detections, diagnostics, and ultimately the level of clinical data and evidence that we're going to need to support a marketing decision to show that it's fit for purpose and the benefits can outweigh the risks. And I know that gives us a full 1 minute to have any other additional questions or
There is
concluding
one
thoughts.
question.
Dr. Barrier, appreciate, again, your very insightful and stimulating questions throughout. I think from both from the audience as well as from yourself. I hope it really reinforced a lot of the concepts whereby it's not just as academicians we like to pontificate and talk about the regulations and the requirements, but give you real world examples and give you the tools necessary to solve these kinds of problems, whether you're facing them at your day-to-day job or looking to transition into regulatory as a career or get on an executive path. It's my hope that the information and examples that we shared with you today were valuable in helping you, audience, to personally achieve that. And we, as Dr. Barry mentioned, happy to continue the discussion. Look forward to hopefully seeing you as a student in our program and potentially doing part 3 and continuing this excellent regulatory matters webinar series at JHU AAP.
So we're out of time, but one question came about regarding can we receive the PowerPoint? Unfortunately, no, but as a reminder, this entire webinar will be available online for you to review at your leisure. There's one more question, and I know a lot of you have to go. We will go ahead and answer this. And if you have to, go away, we know that, but it will be recorded on the webinar. So the final question is, if you're creating your first quality plan for a basic documentation level SAMD, how would you incorporate the elements of the ACP into the quality plan?
Yeah, it starts where you define your user needs, then you proceed to identify the software requirements, and then the software development specs in terms of the actual coding, and then have a risk-based matrix. And once you've gotten to here's the algorithm part and here's the scoring that it's doing, of course, within your data flow diagram that we gave you an example of, that would be part of your SDS, your software development spec. That's the place and location in which you would provide a detailed description of how the algorithm is being developed, how you intend to manage any changes, and can start defining your predetermined change control protocols.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. There is another question, but, we want to respect everyone's time. It's a really good one about Cascade algorithm utilizing layers of residual neural network, but we just don't have time to do that today. I think we might have a part 3 on this. I can even think about, oh my goodness, how this applies to health and wellness, consumer-based products as well. So, this entire area is fascinating, and how AI and machine learning is having such an impact on everything that we're doing right now. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. To check out our degrees at Johns Hopkins Regulatory Science, and also business enterprise and entrepreneurship. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we see you the next time in April, where the subject will be Perspectives on Dietary Supplements Regulations by Dr. Kanta Shelke. Take care, everybody. Thank you.